Let us welcome Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy. And to say a few words about Dr. Gudavarthy, he is an associate professor at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he also serves as the coordinator of Human Rights Center at the School of Public Law and Governance, Calcutta, and also at the National Institute of Human Rights. He specialized in areas related to Indian politics and Indian democracy and issues related to those. He has authored numerous works related to the same, and his forthcoming book is Emotive Majority, Ethics and Emotions in New India. And welcome, Professor Gudavarthy, to the inaugural session.
Thank you. Thanks to Arun, Professor Suresh, and other colleagues in Kerala. One would have ideally wanted to be in person. Kerala is always a wonderful place to be in, but something is better than nothing. So this virtual seminar on a very important theme that Arun has taken up in terms of discussing how do we theorize and conceptualize uh, the relevance and the workings of constitutional morality in contemporary times. Uh, so I would broadly get into the ongoing tensions, theoretical postures that are important in taking up in understanding our own times between constitutional morality on one end and an emergent populist reality on the other end. How do we see the interface between these two conceptual grids is what I will attempt to do. Going back in since the colonial time, since the British colonial time, since the British colonial rule lagged popular will, it drew its rhetorical legitimacy by upholding principles of rule of law and procedural neutrality. In the sense, it offered things like a judicial system, separation of powers, so on and so forth, but it did not enjoy a popular will or a popular representation. So this divide between certain notions of constitutionalism that emerged from liberalism via colonial modernity on one end, somewhat disconnected in its growth from popular representation, democracy, and participation. So in this sense, constitutional morality broadly refers to the constitutional principles that Arun and Professor Suresh have already referred in terms of rule of law, civil rights, principle of equality, right to life, civil liberties, so on and so forth. Now, what is the relevance or the workings of these principles in a post-colonial democracy like
Yeah.
what are the kinds of tensions that this generates? I think at the heart of this question would be constitutional morality on one end, no doubt, refers to much substantive principles like justice and equality. But the thrust of constitutional morality is more procedural in nature. That it is about how to get to these principles. It's more about the means of achieving equality, justice, and that is through legality, rule of law, democratic public institutions. And therefore, some of us would be surprised to listen to what Ambedkar had to say in the Constituent Assembly that I'm quoting him here, that he said that for maintenance of democracy requires we must hold fast to constitutional methods of achieving our social and economic objectives. It must mean that we abandon the bloody methods of revolution. It means we must abandon the method of civil disobedience, non-cooperation, and satyagraha. So one can give many interpretations of why Baba Saheb Ambedkar would state such a thing while he himself led quite a few movements, public protests, street protests for public entry of Dalits to temples, so on and so forth. But at the turn of Indian independence, he seems to have thought that we need to abandon satyagraha and need to bring our methods of social change through available democratic institutions, available legal procedurality, so on and so forth. Now, this is the key question that I think that divide between this assumption that social transformation, social and economic equality should be achieved through constitutional means on one end, and then that we had democracy, which was about popular participation, popular will, about consent, about perceptions, public opinion, political participation, street protests, demonstrations, dissent, so on and so forth. So in much of post-colonial democracies, we now realize there has been a continued tension between these two dimensions of democratic participation and constitutional means. In fact, political theory itself of late has recognized this tension even outside post-colonial democracies. Post-structural philosopher Chantal Mouffe argues that the cohabitation of liberalism and democracy, we now realize retrospectively, was a contingent one. In other words, liberalism is not necessarily a product of democracy, as democracy may not necessarily lead to reinforcement of liberal principles. It was the unique historical moment of Europe due to industrialization, individual ethics, a lot that went into European Enlightenment, that liberalism and democracy came together in a way where liberal modernity and expansion of democratic participation, in some sense, kept reinforcing each other. But that was just one unique historical context, and we seem to have, especially after neoliberal reforms, moved away. There are cracks that have developed between the limitations within liberalism and a certain populist turn in democracies across globe. But I will, of course, focus on the Indian context more closely. One way to make sense of this is through an interesting formulation that Dutch historian Cas Mudde makes, where he argues that the current rise of populism that we are witnessing across globe, whether it is Trump in United States, whether it is Erdogan in Turkey, or Mr. Modi in India, this kind of an illiberal turn in democracies, Cas Mudde argues that this populism, what we're witnessing, is a democratic illiberal response to undemocratic liberalism. So in fact, the current populist authoritarianism is more, I would argue, a crisis of liberalism more than crisis of democracy and democratic participation in itself. In fact, current populist backlash is a response to a certain kind of an undemocratic liberalism that we have had. What that would mean is a certain kind of an overreach of liberal principles without the accompanying social and cultural hegemony necessary. Post-colonial scholars in the Indian context were one of the initial scholars who have kind of alerted us to this underlying tension when they've argued, like subaltern studies, in terms of dominance without hegemony. That much of the new capitalist colonial modernity, modern state that included constitutionalism, did not enjoy that kind of a cultural and a social hegemony. In fact, Partha Chatterjee, a well-known post-colonial theorist, in much of his more recent writings has been focusing on this tension between modernity and democracy in the Indian context. In fact, his famous formulation on political society as against civil society was an attempt to kind of bring out this tension between a constitutionally constrained urban middle class civil society as against the much of subaltern population groups, the urban poor, the peasants, the migrants, who he argues are based more located in political society, which is paralegal, which is based on almost violating all of the liberal assumptions. So that tension, I think, continues in the Indian context between a certain notion of constitutional morality, which adheres to progressive notions of equality, justice, but they are not readily available. And this is, in fact, Baba Sahib Ambedkar himself suggested that constitutional morality is not available readily in India, but it has to be built through liberal constitutional legal means. That's perhaps what Nehruvian consensus, Nehruvian experiment was all about, extending the state through certain liberal assumptions at the core of it in terms of achieving through certain procedural means, equality, social mobility, economic transformation, so on and so forth. But something went wrong in this experiment, which has resulted in what we are witnessing today in India, a kind of a strong populist authoritarianism, which is in violation of all the liberal principles that we have known, and we have kind of, at least in our kind of a sections, we have enjoyed those civil rights, freedom of speech, autonomy to universities, so on and so forth. We are finding that there's a strong backlash. But the more important point is that there seems to be a groundswell of a certain kind of a consent for authoritarian means, as against the overreach of liberal and constitutional state. Therefore, constitutionalism itself seems to be in search of a new hegemony, in search of a new legitimacy, in search of a new second wind, in search of a new life in itself. And how should one understand this crisis? It is one way one can easily pose a kind of a immediate binary between constitutionalism and authoritarianism. The constitutionalism is about democracy, and current it's about authoritarianism and the fascism, so on and so forth. But I don't think the situation is that simple in terms of a clear binary between constitutionalism and authoritarianism. In fact, authoritarianism, unlike 1930s today, is itself growing through the processes of representation, through electoral means. It is India continues to have free and fair elections, and there is some groundswell. At least they're able to win elections. So there is some amount of representation. If you look at the strategies of BJP, they have extended the process of representation to Dalits and OBCs, so on and so forth. Therefore, one cannot immediately jump to the conclusion that the democratic process itself is in a crisis. But it's more liberalism has been pushed to the brink. Liberal ethics have been pushed to the brink, and that's what is in crisis. So our challenge really is in terms of this lack of missing consent for liberalism, which converts into a groundswell for illiberal means. Illiberality of different kind, that is uncivil, that we are all witnessing in various ways. The challenge, therefore, is for us to understand why we are witnessing this crisis, especially when one understands that much of subaltern social classes, in whatever denomination one conceptualizes them, seem to have made certain kind of a shift towards rightward shift, that certain kind of a consent, certain kind of an alignment with the in recognizing that certain illiberal means are necessary for their own social and economic mobility. That's what is the real crisis of liberalism. That is what is the real crisis of constitutionalism in India. And that has multiple sources. I will not be able to theorize the entire thing, but I will try my best to put across as many dimensions of it as possible for us to therefore sit back and think in terms of how we can really there is no doubt that one has to overcome the current situation, but for that one has to read it closely, one has to theorize it in a more comprehensive sense. So one of the starting points, one entry point to understand why this kind of a crisis of liberalism and constitutional ethics and constitutional morality exists in the current times could be that constitutional morality and so as liberalism assumes in itself certain kind of social ethics. It's not merely about political morality. I think usually in our debates we seem to counterpose political morality to social morality, but constitutional morality in itself assumes certain social ethics that behind the procedural justice that constitutionalism talks about, it assumes certain social ethics. And one of the important ethics that it assumes is a secular, open-ended, cosmopolitan kind of an imagination, where we move away from our ascriptive, communitarian, territorial, local identities into more open-ended kind of secular associational social identities. And I would recommend this very interesting book by David Goodhart, Road to Somewhere, where he makes this very fascinating argument that the current divide, he says, in the world, more than on class and racial identities, the divide that is really working in the world is, he says, between somewheres and anywheres. Anywheres are the tiny liberal social cosmopolitan elite, like maybe like us, like myself and Arun, that we are happy to be located anywhere, to live anywhere in India. We have certain kind of a comfort with global mobility, global lifestyles, food habits, in terms of cultural cohabitation, so on and so forth. So constitutional morality in some sense assumes this kind of an open-endedness. But Goodhart argues that 80% of the world, in fact, he argues even in advanced capitalist countries like England, 80% of population continues to remain provincial and local. That they continue to value their ties, ascriptive ties, territorial identification, cultural locationality, including, for instance, Welsh and Scottish. I mean, anyone who would have visited, whether it's United States or England, would immediately see the contrast that the metropolitan cities, whether it's New York or London, are fairly cosmopolitan. There's an interracial mix. But if you just step aside a few hundred kilometers away from these metropolitan cities, you can see that much of United States, much of UK have such closed societies that people have lived in their habitations for centuries. They have not really preferred to move out. So the divide today with neoliberal globalization and the overreach of liberal constitutional methods has really been in terms of have really pushed this overreach towards a certain kind of a cosmopolitan ethic, which is not bad in itself, but the way we went about it on one hand. So I would read populism is actually a symptom, a certain kind of a bottom-up backlash towards against this tiny social elites, which in itself converts into a certain kind of resentment against constitutionalism and institutional spaces. This is the fix that one will need to understand. That in popular imagination, in popular politics, constitutionalism and institutions have come to stand to represent the interests and methods of workings of tiny social elites. That's precisely the reason why political parties like the BJP and far right all across the globe are able to gain certain social traction, are able to gain certain new kind of a social consent towards their illiberal means, which emerge somewhere else. But that's a different point. But the reason that they have a groundswell in contemporary times is because the current round of populist authoritarianism is combining a certain anti-elitist sentiment that is being mobilized for delegitimizing constitutionalism, institutions, and liberal ethics, and combining it with regressive traditionalism. So the consent, rhetorical consent for current authoritarian right-wing politics comes from its anti-elitism in cultural terms, in that which also overlaps with a certain form of class politics, certain form. It may not be in substance and content, but in terms of the rhetoric, it looks like as if they're mobilizing the subaltern classes against a tiny social elite. Therefore, Prime Minister Modi refers to Lutyens, Delhi, Khan Market gang, all these no symbolic no structures that flow around, the narratives that flow around, give a sense that what the right is mobilizing is in terms of a local cultural idiom against a cosmopolitan, displaced, detached, secular, constitutional elite. Populism is therefore able to, therefore, I would say populism is a crisis. It is not a resolution. It is not a resolution of this crisis. It is a kind of a moribund symptom of this crisis, that it is able to, for the time being, produce a rhetoric without necessarily a resolution or moving ahead, but produce a rhetoric that has appeal on the ground. I've referred to this in my own book, India After Modi and Populism and the Right, as performative dialectics. That they're able to combine uncanny, contradictory things into a single narrative. And that's precisely the reason why, at the moment, as we see, they enjoy a certain kind of a cultural hegemony. For instance, the current right wing is pro-corporate, neoliberal, but combined with anti-modernity. That they're able to combine capitalism without modernity. They're able to combine capitalist acquisitive character with community assertion. They're able to deepen social fragmentation, whether one sees in terms of growing social conflicts between Dalits, OBCs, and Muslims, or whether it is in terms of expanding the representation to subcastes within Dalits, subcastes within OBCs. Even as we are witnessing this social fragmentation, you can see that the consent for monolithic social order seems to grow. But traditionally political scientists like Rudolph, Rajni Kothari, all of them, Franz and Frankel, thought that caste was a kind of the best guarantee we have against a majoritarian confessional politics. But that seems to have really Rudolph in fact argue that's the reason why India would always remain a centrist polity, a centrist democracy. But we could see that that has almost turned on its head. That today what we are witnessing is that the more the social fragmentation along subcaste lines, more seems to be the consent for monolithic social order. Why that should be so? There are multiple reasons. I will not have time to get into all of that. But we need to make sense of this reality, this emergent way in which what does it mean that the populist authoritarianism is able to tie up two ends of the spectrum, tie up quite contradictory kinds of social processes together, in spite of which they seem to be enjoying certain social hegemony. And there seems to be a shift, a decisive shift in terms towards from centrist, left center, centrist social democratic character that Indian society, Indian polity enjoyed till 1990 to a center right, center authoritarian kind of a shift that we seem to be. Part of the reason I've argued in my own writings that the Indian populist authoritarianism, on one hand, as I argued, is a response to this anti-elitist rhetoric, anti-elitist sentiment. The second I have argued is also that populist authoritarianism draws its substantive legitimacy from what I've referred to as secular sectarianism. That the way we have perhaps practiced secularism in the Indian context has led to certain fossilization of social ghettoization of communities. The domain of the social has remained more or less untouched. India has been vibrant in terms of the political domain, in terms of political experiments, coalitions, party systems, democratic representation. But on the social front, social prejudices have been left more or less untouched, or we do not really know how to transform these prejudices, because much of these prejudices are integral to the legitimate demands of recognition of subaltern caste and religion. So this is, I think, a key theoretical insight, I would argue that one needs to really build on that. Demands for recognition and popular prejudices are integral to each other in the Indian context. And we really do not know how to segregate them or what to do. Some of you might have seen the recent New York-based Pew Research Center's findings on tolerance in India, and the findings are fascinating. That majority of Indians who have responded, I think the sample size was something to 25 to 30,000 sample size, have reported that have the Pew Research Center in fact conceptualizes Indian notion of tolerance as living together separately. That is, most of Indians who were interviewed valued diversity, but they preferred segregated living. That they were against intercaste, interreligious marriages. So, but they feel diversity is necessary for national integration, for democracy. But socially, they feel that they are much better. They would prefer to live within their communities, both in terms of social habitation, in terms of protecting their cultural practices. So this is the interesting part where on which current populism is able to really grow its strategies. That it pitches its narratives, it pitches its social agenda, it pitches its political agenda on these inherent social prejudices between communities, between caste-based communities, between religious communities, and India has mostly focused on, because the Indian foundation was on a certain separation between the political and the social. Therefore, our political democracy, expansion of political representation often does not translate into a substantive change in social prejudice. In fact, as I said, the crisis has got much deeper because most of the legitimate demands for representation today, most of the legitimate demands for social recognition today are have integral to them a certain popular social prejudices. Now, how do you segregate? That's precisely the reason why, as the democratic subaltern political participation is increasing through more demands for recognition, there seems to be more groundswell for right-wing, monolithic, muscular, top-down, exclusionary agenda. Everyone seems to, in their own locality, seems to be able to represent, see themselves in the mirror of the right. That your own locality, your own social privileges being protected vis-a-vis other less privileged social caste and religious groups is a narrative is on which the monolithic social order is being rebuilt, and that's why perhaps most social groups are able to relate more than or it's only the liberal secular sections which seem to see a process of exclusion and discrimination in it, while subaltern caste religious groups, I would say cutting across religions, are able to see less of discrimination, more of a mode of a new way of preserving their own limited social privileges as they have existed historically. Let me conclude by arguing then, how do we, the real question in front of us today is that, is there a real-time possibility of combining notions of equality and justice in our constitutional morality with a certain popular, representative, inclusive politics? Is there really a method of bringing in local popular ethics that is, I feel, integral to populism without sectarianism? Is there a way of appropriating the democratic ethos, certain democratic ethos integral to populism, and combine it with communitarian sensibilities, with overcoming social prejudices and a certain kind of a socialization that is much more open-ended and much more inclusive in itself? I think this is where much of we need to revisit much of our past propositions. For instance, post-colonial theory has unconditionally laid its premium on community, but that community is also, as Baba Sahib Ambedkar said, that for instance about villages, he said they were dens of ignorance and isolationism, while Gandhi laid premium on villages. Post-colonial scholarship laid its premium on local and village. So therefore, now our question is, that how do we bring in these two processes of maintaining certain communitarian ethics with certain open-ended secular values. Can therefore we see a certain, not a tension, but a certain kind of an overlap combination, certain bringing together of constitutionalism and populism? Is that a real-time possibility? For this, I would argue that what we have to envisage is a social discourse of solidarity in between caste and religious communities. That they need to move towards an ethic from the current ethic of being exclusive and through sequestered identities. We need to move to common demands. For instance, one immediate demand that I can think of is universal common school education. A demand of this kind, which should concern the majority of Dalits, Bahujans, and Muslims, should be able to forge larger intercaste and interreligious solidarity. What we have practiced so far is identity-specific demands, identity caste-specific social mobility. But I'm suggesting that we should need to move to what I would refer to as the third democratic upsurge, which is in terms of larger solidarity between castes, overcoming their social prejudices based on common social demands like full employment, like social, as I said, common school education, so on and so forth. So populist authoritarianism, as I've argued, is a combination of regressive traditionalism of mostly of that represent caste Hindus, but that regressive traditionalism has certain resonance with subaltern castes. That is where one needs to break that notion. And I would argue, I would also make another observation that the current uncivility, the current extra institutional mobilization is also somewhere representing the process of democratization that we have achieved in the last 4 decades. That equality is a romantic ideal, but we all fantasize equality like we all fantasize romance. But just what happens in romance, that once the initial excitement dies out, we descend into reality, and that reality is very different from what we often fantasize. Something similar happens with justice, equality. From a distance, equality looks romantic. We all idealize equality, but when it comes closer to practicing equality, it's a much complex and a very difficult ideal to put up with, because it needs a lot of adjustments and readjustments, and it's not a comfortable and happy. So I think the current populism I see is this recalibration that is happening in Indian society. That it is partly result of the democratization that we have achieved. It is the discomfort that equality is producing in our society. Therefore, we should see that constitutionalism also pitched for equality and justice. Populism is a concrete, uncivil, extra-institutional demonstration of that ethic as we are reaching closer, inching forward closer towards the ethic of equality. Therefore, I wouldn't read constitutionalism and populism necessarily as two polar opposites. But I think if we are able to correctly read the situation, we should be able to rescue the current populism with all its ugliness, authoritarian tendencies, uncivility, extra-institutional dimensions, represents a certain challenge of democratization that we have been able to achieve in the last 4 or 5 decades. And therefore, I feel that one should read the ethic of democratization we have achieved. This ugliness is also partly because of heightened aspirations for equality, a certain social mobility we could have we presented on ground for Dalit, OBCs, and other excluded communities. Therefore, I would read this populism also in one sense, rights essentially on an ethic of democratization at the heart of it. Though the way BJP and other right-wing articulates is through regressive traditionalism. It's a complex mosaic, and therefore I would argue that the way one should read the current moment of populist reality is in terms of seeing how one can rescue and recover that participatory democratic ethic that might exist at the heart of it and wed it with the known constitutional liberal procedural forms. And that's what needs to be our thrust. And that's where I suggested maybe moving to larger social demands. What I refer to the third democratic upsurge might be our best bet to both take the what is good from populism and wed it to constitutional principles for a more sustainable democracy.